So for those of you who call RiverTree home, you know that we are partway through something that we do every year between Christmas and Easter that we call the Jesus season, and it's where we just focus for 2.5 to 3.5 months on the person of Jesus himself. This year, what that looks like is we're just working our way through the Gospel of John, one of the four recountings of the life of Jesus in your New Testament. This week, your chapter to read as we work our way through that gospel is John chapter 6. And John chapter 6 is really one long story. It's got a few different pieces to it, but it's meant to be read as one unit. And so what I want to do for you today as you prepare to read this chapter this week is I'm going to call your attention to one of the overarching dynamics that you're going to run into when you read this one big story that is John chapter 6. Now, just to give you an overview, here's what you're going to encounter when you read through the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John this week. It opens with a miracle. It is one of the only miracles, by the way, that is described or reported in all four of the Gospels. It's the feeding of the thousands, right? You've probably heard that story at some point if you've been around church at all, even if just as a child. So Jesus, with loaves and fishes, feeds a giant crowd of people at the opening of the chapter. And then, after that day passes, his disciples get in a boat to cross the Sea of Galilee, which is actually just a big giant lake in the middle of northern Israel. And it's stormy. And Jesus comes to them walking on the water. So you have a second miracle. This one's much more private than it is public. And then the crowds are still hunting Jesus. After he feeds them and performs the miracle, either the next day or the day after, they're hunting Jesus. He's not in the same spot. But then they find him in a different town that circles the Sea of Galilee, the town of Capernaum. And there they have a very long dialogue. This is what most of John 6 is, about the bread of life. And Jesus calls himself the bread of life. He uses the miracle that he performed earlier in the chapter as a reference point for that. He also uses the miracle of the manna in the desert with Moses in the Old Testament as part of his discussion of being the bread of life. That's what you're going to find in John 6. But here's what I want to talk about today. When you read this story from start to finish, you're going to see something happen, and it's this. Jesus effectively clears the room. We start out with a really big group of people, and by the time we hit the end of John chapter 6, we are down to a very small group of people. He starts out with a crowd, and he ends up with a handful. Why did that happen? Why did what happened on the left side of the screen lead to Jesus running off most of the crowd that was listening to him? Or better said, why did most of the crowd choose to leave? Because of what happened on the left side of the screen. And what we talk about today is going to get at some of the most basic spiritual questions that eventually you're going to ask, if you haven't already, as a Christian person. As you live your faith out, or you are a Christian for years and even decades, eventually you're going to ask those two questions up on the screen. Why do some people walk away? And why do some people choose to stay? If you've done what I've done for long enough as a pastor, you have plenty of examples that you can cite of people in both groups. For example, I went to pastor's school called seminary, which is graduate school, with a number of people who intended to give their life to God's service as ministers or pastors of some capacity. And I have friends from graduate school who were studying to be pastors who fit into both categories. I remember my good friend Ernie that lived on the same floor of the dormitory where I lived for the first part of seminary. Ernie was earnest and devout and sincere, one of those good-natured people of great character that you know from the first time you talk to him, you can trust him 100%. You ever known anybody like that? That was what Ernie was like. Ernie had this one Grateful Dead t-shirt that he wore all the time. So much so that it was threadbare and you could see his back through the t-shirt. But you knew it was Ernie, even if he was walking away from you in the dormitory, because it was that stupid shirt. And you could see all his back through the shirt. And the last thing I heard about Ernie is that he was a professional fisherman in Alaska, and he died on a salmon boat about 5 years ago. Never became a pastor, and he stopped being a Christian about 10 years ago. And I'll bet if you've been around church, you have a story or two about an Ernie in your life too. Or, flipping it around and saying it positively, you probably know somebody who's been a Christian for 40 or 50 years and their faith still seems very vibrant, very alive. They're very grateful to God. They live connected with God and in sync with God. And deep down, what you say to yourself when you see someone like that is, what do I have to do in my life in order for my faith to be lived out in the same way? And I hope that at some point between here and there, I don't walk away either. Yeah, I'm not going to answer everything that can be said about those two questions today. I am going to tell you what this story in John 6 tells you about those two questions that we often ponder or wonder about, especially as we watch the people in our lives that we care about be one or the other of those categories of persons. So I want to walk you through something you watch the crowd do over the course of John 6, and it's going to begin to answer these basic questions that we're led to ask. So this is very close to the start of the chapter, and yes, by the way, for all the music files in the room, thank you! I did intend for you to think of the Clash song with the Stay or Go graphic on the bottom. Well done, Tammy Coyne. So this is very close to the opening of the chapter. And what we're told is that a great crowd of people were following after Jesus or seeking him out because he was doing all kinds of, this is the term that John uses specifically, more than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, about miracles or kind of the God sort of things that Jesus did, the big things that Jesus did. He calls them signs. And that's a great visual, right? It's like Jesus is holding up a placard and it says, God is here, or God is at work. Every time Jesus does a sign, it's like what he's doing. And Jesus had been doing all kinds of that stuff, so they just kept following after him. This is before the feeding of the thousands. They're after him because he performs all kinds of signs. And then he feeds the thousands, and you read this. After the people saw that sign, the feeding of the thousands that Jesus had performed, this is how on board they were with Jesus at the front end of the chapter. Surely this is the promised prophet that was to come to us in the Old Testament, so we want to go make this man king right now. They wanted to start a revolution, an insurrection against the Roman Empire. Jesus is their leader right then and right now because of the signs, the miracles, the big God things that he was doing. So after the feeding of the thousands, this was their response. Jesus withdraws from them because he knows what's going on in the crowds. He understands what they want to do. The next day, the crowds show up and are seeking Jesus out more. And Jesus says to them, let me tell you why you're really looking for me. Yes, like at the beginning of the chapter, you're looking for me because I'm a miracle worker. I do amazing things. I say amazing things. God seems present in me in big ways like you've never seen before in your life, and that's why you're looking for me. And in this case, he says, and it's not just that, I fed you. Who doesn't like a full belly? Church is better with lunch than without, right? By the way, this, for us, in our day and time, none of us probably this morning came here hungry. That was not true in that day and time. When those people sought Jesus out, you're talking about a lot of working poor people, a lot of impoverished people. When Jesus did the miracle of the bread and the fish, he fed them, and for some of them it might have been their only meal that day. So it was a big deal to them that Jesus provided for their physical needs. But Jesus tells them the day after, look, I know why you're really here. It's not just that I'm a miracle worker. It's that I provided for your physical needs, and it's really not much deeper than that. And it is from these verses that he launches into the very long discussion about he himself being the spiritual bread of life that will feed them in a way that physical food never could. And in so doing, he makes some remarkable claims about himself, like, I, me, Jesus, am the bread of life. Nobody else. Me. I am the only one who is this. And so just a few verses later, when Jesus starts to make these claims about himself, here's what the crowd says back to him. What sign will you then give that we may see it and believe in you? What will you do? Okay, time out. In chapter 6, verse 2, he had already done all kinds of signs, right? That's why they sought him out in the first place. And he just miraculously fed thousands of people with a few loaves and a few fish. And yet, that's not enough. They say back to him, whoa, you've already done all kinds of signs, but now you're starting to make demands on our life. You're starting to call yourself the bread of life that will feed us spiritually. You're starting to ask more of us. So the signs you've already done aren't enough. We need more. Thank you very much. We need more proof in order for us to listen and accept what you're saying. There's an irony here. They're asking him for a sign. The guy's already done tons, right? And so from here, Jesus continues to talk about himself and what he can do for them if they accept him as the bread of life that will nurture them spiritually and nourish them spiritually in a way that physical food never could. And they have back and forth, back and forth. You'll get a chance to read it this week. Here's the end of the chapter. After that, this is where we end. And from that moment, many of his, not even just the crowd, many of his followers, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. The Gospel of John is full of single verses that are extraordinarily poignant. You're going to get a couple of them today. This is one. How powerful is that to read that Jesus draws this crowd through all his miraculous activity, and then by the end of the chapter, simply because he starts to make claims about himself, he ends up with many of them walking away. What's that make you think about why the crowd left? Based on those verses that I showed you throughout the entirety of the chapter that tracks the crowd's attraction to Jesus and then their response to Jesus. Why'd the crowd leave? Well, here may well be the most instructive thing for us 2,000 years later, who are trying to build a spiritual life, who are trying to follow Jesus too. Apparently, signs aren't enough. You get that from what I've told you so far? Signs aren't enough. Now, let's not use sign. Let's use what I have on the screen. Big, palpable, intense, spiritual, or God moments are not enough to get you to stick around with Jesus. Because if they were, the crowds wouldn't have left. Jesus had to be worn out from doing all of the miracles he had done that attracted that crowd to him. But it wasn't enough to get them to stick around. This, by the way, is routine in all of your Gospels. It's even true in the book of Acts that tells the history of the church. Oftentimes, there were miracles that happened, and crowds would be attracted to those miracles. And then we'd start to talk about the rest of Christianity and how it's about your whole life and obeying and believing and submitting to what Jesus wants you to do. And at that point, things got real serious, and the signs or the big God moments weren't enough. Now here's the key. Maybe you can recognize with me that sometimes when we talk about what spirituality is or what Christianity is, we're not very careful. And we set people up, or even ourselves up, for false expectations. What we seem to indicate to people is that if you follow God, you can go from big moment to big moment to big moment. Every Sunday is going to be a rock concert. And we're going to fan the flames of your emotion higher and higher and higher. And if you don't get that emotional, spiritual high when you're here, then we've failed. I wonder if that's sustainable over the long haul. This story would tell me the answer to that is no, it's not. Or we tell people, gosh, if you're in a pinch, if you're in a crisis, if you're in a tough spot, all you have to do is pray. And what you ought to do is expect that God's going to intervene in some miraculous, positive way. And he's going to get you out of that pickle in the best possible way, in a sign kind of way, in a big divine moment kind of way. And it's going to be miraculous. And then it doesn't happen. And what are people left to think? You catch an illness at 35 that's going to be with you the rest of your life. And your well-intentioned Christian friends say, I'm going to pray for you, and I want you to pray. And we want to pray for healing. Because healings do happen. But they just don't happen for you. And now what do? Do you stay or do you go? Like I said, you need to recognize with me, sometimes we're not very careful in how we talk or how we present what Christian experience is going to be like. We make it sound as if every day of your life, every week of your life is going to be a feeding of the 5,000 kind of moment. And the truth is, that's not how faith works. Actually, if the biblical record is any indication, and if the spiritual greats of church history are any indication, here's what you have to know. You as a faithful, obedient Christian are going to go through seasons of your life, and I can't tell you how long, when God may seem absent. And you're worried that you've walked away from him or you don't know where he is. You're afraid that you've gone astray, you've done something wrong, and it's your fault, and you can't find him anywhere. One of the great expressions for this from St. John of the Cross is, it's the dark night of your soul. And at some point, every well-meaning, sincere Christian person experiences something like that. And if you are too dependent on intense, positive, spiritual highs, you will never make it through something like that. Just like this crowd. Or, to be more specific, in the case of this crowd, what happened to him is they loved Jesus. When he was doing things for them, or he was performing miracles that wowed them and made them aware of God's presence among them, they loved that part of it. And then Jesus started to say, hey, I'm the bread of life. And you need to give your life to me and eat what it is that I'm all about and what I'm telling you. And if you do, you're going to gain eternal life. He started to ask things of them. This is not merely about miracles. This is about you trusting me and giving me your life. And at that point they said, Bye. Worse yet, what they said is, prove it to me. I've seen you do tons. Do more. And if you do more, then maybe I'll follow a little more. What a lovely little codependent, enabling spiritual dynamic they set up. Every time God asks something of you, they just say, oh, God, I'll be happy to do it if you prove it to me by doing something else that's this big, divine thing. And you better believe 2,000 years later, you and I are capable of the same thing. At some point in your Christian life, if it hasn't happened already, Jesus is going to push you. He's going to ask something of you that he hasn't asked before. You're going to realize, wow, Jesus is making a demand on a part of my life that I've never heard him speak to me about before. He wants me to change something or improve something. And now what am I going to do? Am I going to be like the crowd and fold my hands and say, sure, I'll do it once you prove yourself to me again? Or do you just do it anyway? See, the bottom line here is what you see in the crowd is something that is all too common among Christians of our day. That we want the big, miraculous, intense experiences to drive our faith along from year to year, decade to decade. And when we do that, we set ourselves up for failure. Just like this crowd. But at the end of the chapter, when we are told that many chose to walk away because their belief or commitment to Jesus was founded on the big, miraculous stuff that they saw, Jesus then turns to the 12. Peter, James, John, Matthew, those guys. He turns to the 12 and he asks them, and I told you, sometimes in the Gospel of John, there are verses that will take your breath away. These are those. How do you think Jesus felt watching everybody walk away? Now, he knows human nature. He's probably not surprised by it. I can assure you it broke his heart. And then he looks at his 12 best friends on the earth and says, so are you going to leave me too? And Peter, whatever you think of Peter and the mistakes he might make later in Jesus' life, he hits this one right on the head. Peter says to Jesus, in words that I would recommend to you, you never forget. Lord, to whom are we going to go? Where else can we go? For what? Where else can we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. We have believed and now have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. Where else will we go? For what? What made these 12 guys stick around when everybody else took off? Well, the first phrase Peter uses is this. Where else are we going to go for the words of life? Here's what's going to make your faith last. Here's what's going to allow you to weather the ups and the downs that are inevitable in any spiritual life. The dry seasons and the good seasons. Here's part of it, according to Jesus and Peter. Have you found that in your life, Jesus has given you the words of life? His teaching, what he said. Here's what Peter means. Have you found in your own life, not somebody else's, not mine that you hear me talk about on Sunday morning, yours. In your own life, have you found that when you listen to something Jesus said or taught, whatever it is in the Gospels, you pick one, and when you decided, I am going to try to live by that toward maybe a specific person, or just in general, I'm going to try to do that. And then a month or two later, you reflect back and realize, wow, that has really changed me. that has given me life. It has taken me from what I was to something new that I couldn't predict. That's so much better. Maybe it's you choose to stop judging people. Maybe it's you choose to be a peacemaker. Maybe it's you choose to be gentle. Maybe it's you choose to forgive as much as you ask God to forgive you. These are the actual words of Jesus. Doesn't matter to me. But you should have, if you're a Christian person who's been after this for any amount of time at all, you should be able, like Peter does here, to identify, yes, I can find the places where I have tried to apply in my own life the actual words of Jesus, and they have given me life like I've never experienced before. That'll make you stick with Jesus through the good and the bad, the up and the down of faith. Or, like Peter says it, where else are you going to go? You can only get that from him. Nowhere else. However beneficial all the self-help books are in your favorite bookstore, they are not the words of life. Those come from one source, Jesus. And those make you stick with him. Which also means, by the way, if you're not willing to do that, if your Christianity is something other than hearing the words of Jesus and trying to use them and in so doing find life, you're setting yourself up for failure. Because there are a whole lot of other Christians who ground their faith in a whole lot of other things, and it's not enough to stick with them. Not for the duration of your lifetime, it's not. But this does. Here's the other thing Peter says, and it's about a wager that we all make. He said, I can't go anywhere else to find the words of life or to find someone in whom I have believed, and by believing I have then come to know that he is in fact the Holy One of God. He says it that way, and I say it to you that way for you to see the connection or the sequence. We believe, and then we come to know. And it's a wager that we all make. The truth is, all of us, even when you first came to Jesus for the first time, be it as a child or a teen or as an adult, when you came to Jesus for the first time and said, yep, you're my guy. I am going to give my life to you. I am going to follow you. When you did that, you were making a wager. You were making a wager that your trust in him would be validated over the next years or the rest of your life. But you had no evidence to back that up, or very little anyway. You believed before you knew or experienced much of anything. That's how it works. You will always go through seasons of your life as a Christian person where you have to trust God or believe him before you really have any reason to know that it's all going to pan out well. But as long as you know that, it helps you stick close to Jesus, helps you continue to follow after God, because you know there are just going to be times where you have to take the risk. You are venturing out onto the ocean, not sure what the course may be. This is what Peter found. But what he said is, as I have believed, then I have come to know. And knowing in the Bible is not really intellectual. It's far more relational and experiential. As I have believed and taken the risk of giving my life to Jesus, as I've done that, sure enough, it's played out. And I've begun to experience what he promised in his teachings. I believe and then I know. I believe and then I experience. That'll help you stick with him. That'll help you go the long haul. That will help you stay. Don't ever be surprised that you're going to have to believe before you experience. It's what he did. But sure enough, it pans out in the end. There's an expression that I used in the title of the message today, and it's very simply the phrase, built to last. It's a very interesting business book done now, 15, 20 years ago by a guy named Jim Collins. He did a study of companies that were very successful initially, but then were able to continue that success over the long haul. Because the truth is, most fast-starting companies are not successful over the long haul. And the title of that study is Built to Last. So, for instance, in some of these companies that start really, really big or start really, really well and then are able to continue, he found that one of the secrets to their success is they didn't diversify. They stayed good at the things that they were good at and didn't allow their focus to be diffused or pushed out to other new ventures. They had singular focus and they stayed about their initial mission and vision as a company. Okay? They also hired from within. They were very careful to cultivate talent within their company and then let that talent advance up through the ranks. Well, what you've experienced today in John chapter 6 is the spiritual equivalent of Built to Last. There are certain things you as a Christian can know or tell yourself or see that will help you have a faith that is going to last your lifetime. And there are certain things you need to avoid. And it's what you see in the dynamic of the crowd and the disciples in John chapter 6. If you want to have a faith that's built to last, you cannot be dependent on those big, divine, intense moments that sometimes it seems like everyone says are going to be commonplace. Nope. You're setting yourself up for failure if that's what you expect. However, if you're like Peter, and you're willing to devote yourself to the words of Jesus and let them bring you life, you're going to make it the long haul. Or if you are willing to believe in advance of your experience of what is to come, you're setting yourself up for sustained success over the long haul of your spiritual life. That's the only way to build a faith that lasts, instead of being part of the fickle crowd like in John 6. So would you take a minute here at the end of the message? And all I want you to do really is to give God a moment to speak to you about maybe what stood out to you as we talked about Peter and the crowds and the nature of enduring, lasting faith as we see it in John 6. Just take a minute and use those prompts up on the screen. You pray about what you want, and then I'll pray for us all.